So I have with me today Gary Bengier, the author of Unfettered Journey. And we have a few minutes to chat about this amazing story. And Gary, I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about this story in terms of it being a story of struggle and resistance in an imperfect world. Tell me more about sort of the how you got started with the story and what this means to you.
Well, you're right. This is a many-layered story. In fact, it has layers like an onion, as someone famous once said. I think, what was that, Shrek? Talk
Yeah.
about that. Uh, and yeah, so it has many layers, and it starts with a layer of philosophy. So I spent a career in Silicon Valley, and then after that, I turned to passion projects, and I spent over a decade going back to school, backfilling an undergraduate degree first in physics and astronomy. And then that got me interested in philosophy. So then I backfilled a philosophy undergraduate, and then that led to me getting a master's in philosophy. So that was the impetus. My focus was on philosophy of mind, and that's what I wrote my master's thesis on. So that got me thinking deeply about questions of consciousness and what is the mind, and then some related issues of, do we have free will? So those philosophical questions sort of led to the novel, because I thought that I'd like to get these ideas in front of a wider audience. I think the average intelligent reader needs to be challenged a little bit more, and that's what I tried to do. So that's the basis for the book in terms of underlying ideas. So there are some deep philosophical ideas behind this. And in fact, I started with writing something that's called Unfettered Journey Appendices. It's an academic book with 3 academic papers. And so that's the rigorous philosophy of mind behind it.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like in terms of this piece of struggle and resistance, feels right now like a particularly pertinent phrase that it's certainly in the light of a pandemic and various other challenges, especially those of us on the west coast of the United States are dealing with in terms of fires, on the East Coast, storms, just this need to be resilient. And so have you found that, well, first of all, when did you start the writing of this?
So as I said, I spent 10 years going back to school, and
Yeah.
then I spent another decade almost thinking about these issues, and I started thinking about the book shortly after 2011, and then that started to take hold. So I spent 3 or 4 years actually writing the novel. And I intentionally made it many layered. So one of the layers, as you pointed out, is sort of a resilience thing. It's an action adventure story in the sense that the characters are challenged to find how they can get along in an imperfect world. And it's actually set in the future, in the year 2161, 141 years in the future. So it's speculative fiction, thinking about what that future might look like. But at the same time, there's a large part of the book that is much more simpler, and it then raises the issue of, can we survive without the technology that we get used to? And so there's a comparison between our technological world, and as we struggle with the speed of living in that world, versus thinking back to a simpler time, and what are some of the pluses and minuses of that. So I do have that as a major theme.
Yeah. Just I love what were saying about about the challenging of readers in terms of, how as we read, um, that these challenging questions of philosophy are things that we're not usually addressing or thinking about necessarily, or thinking about in any um, deep way, right? So occasionally we may bump up against that question of what are we doing here anyway?
Yes,
You know,
yes,
these kinds of basic questions that probably everybody, hopefully everybody, at least at once in their life asks themselves, right? But to go into that deep exploration of it, of questions like that, seems to me that you're providing a great service to us. Um,
well, that started with Socrates, who said, "An unexamined life is not worth living."
right.
Now, one of the characters in my book actually counters that and says, "No, Socrates was wrong. Every life is worth living, but those that are examined with our consciousness are more interesting." And so we should try to be more interesting in that little bit of time we have here um, on Earth and in the universe to try to figure out why. We should think more deeply. Why are we here? And then I raise the questions about consciousness. What is that I that is you? What's that I at the center of your experience of the universe? What is that really? And so I mentioned again, this is a multi-layered journey. It's set in the future. The main character is Joe, an AI scientist, and he's trying to make robots and AIs conscious. And he struggles with that problem. And that takes him to a small university where he finds love, and then the story goes from there. So part of the book examines that question, and is what is consciousness and what is that I? And it does it through the lens of asking, can we make our machines conscious?
Right. Yeah. Certainly a very hot topic right now, I think.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And I take a different tact. Again, I said this is multi-layered because I take a hard science approach. I think that many science fiction and fantasy books these days have sort of given up about trying to accurately forecast the future because it's so hard.
Yeah.
If you wrote a book, a sci-fi book before 2007, you could have easily have missed the iPhone.
Right.
And so those stories are all wrong, right? And so they're so dated. And so I think a lot of writers have kind of given up, and then they have dragons and they have fantasy, and they have nothing that follows real science. So you have faster than light spaceships. And I think that does a disservice because then the average person has no idea what the future will really look like. And they imagine we'll be cyborgs or something crazy like that, which just isn't going to happen. A million years of evolution has primed the human species to outrun the cat, right?
Right. Right.
And so we're really good at using vision and hearing to sense the world, and you're not going to connect computers, which are ridiculously faster than our chemical-based brains, right? You're not going to make that connection very easily because there's a bottleneck there based upon evolution.
Yeah.
So we're not really going to become those machines. I don't think so. But we'll be different.
Uh-huh.
But we will be different in a way that will feel realistic. So as an example of this hard science, take your iPhone that you probably carry around all the time, right? We all do.
Yeah.
And now imagine, 140 years in the future. What's that like? Well, it's probably a chip, and it's probably embedded, in your head. I mean, 2 weeks ago, Elon Musk demonstrated the Neuralink, right? And it's basically a device about the size of a nickel that they embed in your skull, and it has little wires, and it starts to try to read brain signal as well. Yeah, I think that's again going to be limited because of what I just suggested, that the connections aren't going to be easy. But we could imagine, take Google Glass, right? And imagine Google Glass 5.0. Well, what's that like? The first versions were really silly looking and no one wore them really. But if you take that forward, you could imagine that we might have that as a corneal implant, right? A little screen in the corner of your eye that's attached, wirelessly to the chip in your embedded behind your ear. And so now what happens is you're tied to the internet, to the cloud, and you can basically say something, and it's just like Googling, and the images will pop into the corner of your eye, right? So, okay, now that sounds really weird. We've got a chip in our head, but it's not a whole lot different than having the phone in our hands. So,
right.
So
yeah, most people have the phone pretty much attached to the ear anyway, right? It's
yeah,
already
exactly.
just make it smaller, and you don't have to hold it.
Yeah, yeah.
hands-free.
But at the same time, we're not going to have our brain connected, because how will that work? So in my book, I have a conceit. So the character gets on an airplane, and the social norm at that time is that you can talk to yourself walking around, which we do today. But if you're on something like an airplane, you don't do that. It's rude. So as a child, you learn to a few dozen to 100 words, and they're keywords, and you can think them, and then it can sort of catch the gist of your thoughts, and you can do some work that way. But it's not nearly as efficient as just talking. So
Right,
yeah.
right.
So
It makes me think in this moment about some of the experiments that have been done in terms of random generator, REM. No, what's it called? Random generator machines that were done in Princeton and at the Pear Labs, where they were demonstrating that thought was changing what was happening in terms of the random generators,
yes,
um, so that the thought was having the impact and
yes,
demonstrating that was true.
yes. So on one level, thoughts are electrical signals, and we can probably improve that. But that still doesn't get to the essence is what is that I? It is you, right? At the center of
Right.
your. And so those are the kind of deeper questions that I raise from a philosophical point of view.
Yeah.
So
And when
again,
you
that's another level. So yeah.
Yeah. And so when we talk about having that conversation, being at the intersection of science and religion, you've talked about the science piece. And what does that look like for you in terms of that intersection?
Okay, so I think let me to answer that first tell you one other piece in the equation. Looking at a hard science view of the future, we can see that AI and robotics are advancing. And in fact, I think there was a major consulting firm that suggested that somewhere around 2050 would have 70% of the jobs would be, become automated. Now, I think that's silly, because I think the development of AI and robotics, we sort of something like the automobile. The automobile, yes, it was invented in the 1880s, and by Henry Ford's time, we had mass production. But the automobile did not really become the car that we think of for a century, because you need windshield wipers, you need starters, you need roads, you need a legal infrastructure to deal with injuries. You need this enormous amount of things around to make it really happen. So it'll take a lot longer than anyone thinks. But don't we all believe it's going to get better and better and better? So that's one idea. So what happens with that? So I attended a workshop at the Santa Fe Institute a year and a half ago called AI and the Barrier of Meaning. And it was done by all these AI scientists around the United States, including people from Facebook AI research and Google research on AI, et cetera. And so we were dealing with how do you overcome that barrier of meaning to get them to really think, right? And the conclusion was fairly cynical among this group of folks. So they sort of agreed with, and there are people 30 to 40 years in the field. So they agreed it's going to take a lot longer. But there was one presentation from a gentleman who talked about the jobs issue. And he said, think of a topology of landscape where the hills and valleys are the jobs, and there's a water level rising, which is AI and robotics taking those jobs over. So there'll be some jobs at the top of the hills, like strategists, that'll be very hard to automate, right? But I suggest that one of the jobs at the top is roofer. Okay, so it's really hard to climb up on a roof with a load of shingles and nail them up there. So roofers are going to be making hundreds of thousands of dollars before that last job gets automated. And of course, then we will probably, highly likely, I think, our robots will be sort of our size, because they will fit in these trillions of dollars of infrastructure that fits humans. Mm-hmm. So, okay, now we can just, again, use the hard science and imagine that there'll be more and more of them. And then what changes when that happens? So think about that. Every one of us, okay, so now the robots already can, they can mine the ores, they can make the steel, they can automate the factories. The robots can then build the factories that build more robots.
Right.
And when robots are making robots in high volume, then it's sort of all over, and when they're general purpose enough to do all these jobs, including roofer. Now you, Becky, could have 20 robots working for you.
Right.
So now the entire economy changes because it's not limited by the individual productivity of any one person. And so we're going to have tons of stuff. So my forecast is just in that many years, even without robotics, we'll have something between 15 and 20 times more stuff in the world per person.
Oh my God.
In the world. And that's just based upon, the world's global economy has been increasing by 1 to 4% a year, okay, for the last century, because of already we figured out how to get more efficient. But now you have robotics on top. So we're going to have lots of stuff, but we're not going to have any jobs, right?
Right.
Now back to your question about, spirituality and purpose. What do we do when we don't have jobs? How do we find purpose in that kind of world? What's that world like? What do we do with our time here? And then we can really ask the question, what's the purpose for us in this universe? And so that's how I get to that theme in my book.
Yeah, that really calls forward the how job-centered our purpose has become, at least in the economies, that of the industrialized world.
Yes. Yes.
It also raises for me the questions of, man, we're going to need some serious AI to be working out the environmental issues that are going to be associated with having so much more stuff.
Well, right. There's a lot of issues with that, and so yeah. In fact, climate change is real. The science is clear, and one of the questions is, will we solve that or not, or will we be able to fix it? So the conceit in my book is that after the climate wars fought over diminishing resources such as water and arable land, that the world does finally come together and has figured out how to work collectively to address the issue. And at that point, they can get back to baseline in only another 17 centuries.
Mm-hmm.
Now, actually, that's probably a hopeful thought. There was a talk at the Santa Fe Institute 2 months ago, a Zoom call workshop, and Dan Schrag at Harvard University, he's a geologist there, and he said at the time, people in the field, quote, have already given up on Greenland. And because the science is pretty clear that it's almost impossible to probably stop the melting of the ice in Greenland, even if we did everything we could now. So, but it's a really long time frame for that to happen. It's a couple millennia.
Right.
So we will be living with this for a long time. We can do things to fix it. And so, we're worried about climate change like in the last 10 years, really. It's become the focus. But this is going to go on for many centuries, I think, is a problem. So, it's a hard science problem. In my book, we've lost, Venice is lost. Some other cities have lost. New Orleans is lost. I think that's realistic. Have you been to Venice? They've got the bridges, including the Rialto Bridge, and they all have about 1 meter clearance for the boats getting. We're clearly going to have 1 meter of ocean rise. I mean, right now, I think one day out of 3 Piazza San Marco floods today.
Wow.
Today, there's 1/3 the population in Venice as there was 30 years ago. 2/3 of the population moved out across the bridge on the mainland, so they don't have to deal with it every day. And Venice has already turned into a sort of a Disneyland, mostly made up of people coming in to deal with the tourists. So, it's going to be lost. They just don't have enough money and technology to save it. So
it's the new Atlantis, right? It's the underwater. Disneyland.
So the last layer, which is I think a really crucial one, is social justice. So what happens when you have the machines doing all the work and there are no jobs? What happens? Who owns the robots?
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, there's a story a month ago that Jeff Bezos is worth over $200 billion, right?
Yeah.
And so the conceit of the book is that that's not sustainable. But what happens then is that as we have so much stuff, the means of production, the robot factories are owned collectively. Everyone has a guaranteed income and housing, etc. And in exchange for that, because the United States is very property rights driven, as opposed to the rest of the world, which has a little bit more egalitarian solutions, the U.S. says, in exchange for having the means of production owned by everybody, there are now levels. From 1, the highest level, to 99, the lowest level, and you're assigned a level, and you can move up and down the levels. So there's some merit-based formula, but there's always the sense that maybe there's some biases in the way levels end up, and maybe there's some hereditary legacy in the levels. So that's the big social justice question at the center of the book. And
the class system shifted to a level system, or a different way of, but basically a class system still.
Yeah, well, but in fact, you raised a good question. I mean, do we have levels today?
Seems like it.
It does. So it's yes, maybe we do, right? So this is sometimes speculative fiction. One of its purposes is as much to talk about the future as to shine a light on our current situation, and so that's where that theme comes up in my book.
Yeah, and I think that's a terrific endeavor on one hand, and that you've done a great job in actually achieving that for us. I just want to. I'm reminded also of a production, off-Broadway production in New York called Rags Parkland that was addressing this issue of partly AI, but also this question of social justice in the context of those people who are fully human and those people who are maybe partially mechanical, right?
Yes, okay.
And so different, like just taking a look at social justice and oppression and reapplied in a different set of groupings, but still very active.
Right. So, well, and so this one gives you a different lens on social justice among groups, and so one of the main characters is fighting for social justice, and so the book is, as I said, to summarize, many layered. It's a hard science view of the near future. It's an action adventure. It's a love story about two characters trying to find purpose in an imperfect world, and it has a powerful social justice theme with powerful women characters who I'm very proud of in the book.
Great. Well, thanks again, Gary, for taking this time to talk with me about this Unfettered Journey. And again, this is Gary F. Bengier, and thank you.
Thank you, Becky.